How's it going, everyone? This is Takai, and today I'm going to be talking about shutter speed. The shutter speed is the fraction setting in your camera that affects the way that the motion in your footage looks and is normally used in photography but could also be used in video. This will determine if your footage has blurry movement, also known as motion blur, or if it has very jittery movement, which means less motion blur. When you set it to a smaller number, that means you're going to have more motion blur and you're going to let in more light. Let's say, for example, you set your shutter speed to the standard 1/50th of a second. That means that the shutter is opening and closing at 1/50th of a second, which means that it's opening and closing kind of slow. Where if you brought it down to 1/4 of a second, it's going to be opening and closing even slower. Because the shutter is opening and closing slower, that means the shutter is giving the sensor more time to be exposed to light, and it's capturing more movement per frame. When you set it to a higher number, that means you're going to have less motion blur and the shot is going to look more choppy, and you're going to be letting in less light. If you set your shutter to a faster shutter speed like 1/125th of a second, then the shutter is going to be opening and closing much faster. So the amount of time that your sensor is exposed to light is much less, and it's also capturing less movement per frame. The higher you go, like 1/1000th of a second, the shutter will open and close even faster than 1/25th and lets in less light. What shutter should you be using? It really just depends on what frame rate that you're shooting at, but the rule of thumb is to always set your shutter to be double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then you should be using 1/48th, but most cameras normally don't have that, so just round it up to 1/50th. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, your shutter should be 1/60th. 60 frames per second should be 1/120th, but normally cameras have 1/125th. And I think you get the picture here as you move up to higher frame rates. Do you have to use these shutter speeds? I wouldn't go as far as to say that you have to use these shutter speeds. They're really just a rule of thumb. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second and you're using 1/40th or 1/60th instead of 1/50, it's not going to kill your footage. In fact, you're probably not even going to really notice it. It's when you stray too far away from these shutter speeds is when you start to notice the difference. Like I said before, it's a rule of thumb and not a hard set rule, but those settings are normally what's recommended. And also sometimes you may have a setup where you want the extra motion blur or you want the jittery effect. Like situations where you would want more motion blur would be time lapses, dream sequences, or drug hallucinations. And times you would want a faster shutter speed would be fight scenes, visual effects shooting, or fast action sports. But at that point, it's really just a creative decision, not a technical decision. Why can't I get proper exposure with these shutter speed settings? When you're shooting outdoors and using the proper shutter speed, you're not going to be able to shoot at shallow depths of field, because since the lens is more open and the shutter is slower, the camera is letting in too much light, so your shot isn't going to be properly exposed, which forces you to either bump up the shutter to a higher number or stop down your lens to f/22. Your footage isn't going to look that good either way. So what you're going to need is an ND filter. An ND filter is a filter you stick in front of your lens, and the filter darkens the image. And if you want to learn more about ND filters, check out my video here. What is shutter angle? Shutter angle is going to be found in more video focused cameras or cinema cameras. Shutter angle is pretty much the same thing, but it's a lot easier to use. How it works is instead of the shutter opening and closing like a shutter speed, think of it like a circle that spins around in front of your sensor, and the settings you choose determines what fraction of that circle is exposing the camera sensor to light. So the standard shutter angle you would be using is 180 degrees. This means that half of that circle is opening and spinning around and letting light into the sensor. Half of the shutter being open at 180 degrees is also the equivalent to your shutter speed being double your frame rate. So you would be getting similar motion blur that you would get when shooting 24 frames per second at 1/50 or 60 frames per second at 1/125, and so on. When you open the shutter angle to 360 degrees, that means the entire sensor is exposed to light, which means that this is the equivalent to using a slower shutter speed since the sensor is more exposed and letting in more movement per frame. Then when you shoot at 90 degrees or lower, that means the sensor has a 90-degree opening, which is the equivalent to using a faster shutter speed because less of the sensor is exposed to light and will give you more jittery movements since it's capturing less movement per frame. Which one should you use? I personally like using shutter angle for video, and the reason why is because it's a setting that's pretty much set it and forget it. When I said earlier that using 180 degrees was equivalent to setting the shutter at double the frame rate, using this setting covers you in every single frame rate mode you would ever shoot in. It's almost like auto shutter speed, but it's not. If you're shooting in 180 degrees in 24 frames per second, then decide to switch to 60 frames per second, you don't have to change the shutter angle to something faster because 180 degrees will always by default be a shutter speed that is double the frame rate. And if you're using shutter speed, anytime you change your frame rate, you have to change the shutter to double that frame rate manually. And when you're in a hectic shooting situation, it's an easy thing to forget. So shooting in shutter angle gives you the freedom to not have to think about what shutter speed you need to be using. Especially when you get into using frame rates past 120, I always had to pull out a calculator to calculate what my shutter should be because ironically, I'm not good at math. But with shutter angle, I never have to think once about it. All I have to think about is, do I want more motion blur, regular motion blur, or no motion blur? So if your camera has it, I would highly recommend using shutter angle. But if you're shooting photos or your camera doesn't have it, then just stick to shutter speed. So that's the video for today, guys. I hope you learned a lot from my talking face. And if you want to see more from me, be sure to hit the like button, hit subscribe, and follow me on my other social media platforms that I never post on. Have an amazing day, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.